Good afternoon, colleagues. It's 3 o'clock, but maybe we wait a minute or two before we begin. Of course, a pleasure to see our esteemed panel with us. We'll just begin in about a minute or so. All right, maybe we begin because we have about 100 colleagues online at the moment. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and of course, a good afternoon or good morning to colleagues joining from other parts of the world. This, of course, is the Interagency Standing Committee thematic briefing. We obviously hold these briefings on a regular basis to share information on critical issues of relevance to humanitarian action that is under the purview of the IASC. My name is Yassin Samatar. I'm a member of the Interagency Standing Committee Secretariat, and I have the honor, of course, of hosting today's briefing, which is aimed at raising awareness about the recently passed UN Security Council Resolution 2664, which establishes a transverse humanitarian exemption across UN sanctions regime. The humanitarian community has hailed this resolution as a landmark point, marking a shift in the UN Security Council's approach to the interaction between its sanctions and principled humanitarian action. And of course, our briefing today will be focused on 3 key areas. First, you will hear about the resolution and the IASC member organizations' respective interpretations of its parameters. Second, our guest speakers will clarify what reporting is required under the resolution and what can be done to ensure robust participation in the process. Third, you will hear about what remains to be done by member states and other actors in this space to maximize the concrete positive impact of the resolution. And of course, colleagues, before we begin, I just want to offer our thanks and note the importance of the instrumental efforts, particularly in the area of advocacy by humanitarian partners, which led to the landmark adoption of this UN Security Council Resolution 2664. The resolution provides what is known as a humanitarian carve-out, a standing humanitarian exemption to the asset freeze measures imposed by United Nations sanctions regime. It was also in large part, I should say, thanks to the leadership of some member states, notably the United States and Ireland, as co-drafters of the resolution. And of course, the humanitarian community and its partners now have a clear signal and commitment from member states that UN asset freezes shall not prohibit or impede the activities necessary to the provision and delivery of critical humanitarian assistance, even if transfers of resources to UN designated actors are involved. This resolution directs the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, the chair of the Interagency Standing Committee, Mr. Martin Griffiths, to brief relevant sanctions committees on an annual basis. And the OCHA country offices are, of course, in the lead for reporting, compiling the information for these briefings to the sanctions committees. This year, the briefings will take place in the fall, starting in October and ending in November 2023. The resolution is, of course, an essential step, but not an end in itself. Effective domestication and implementation by member states is essential. Further action is also needed to effectively address years of caution and overcompliance among all those involved in humanitarian operations, from donors to humanitarian organizations themselves, to their private and banking sector partners. And changes are also needed across various legal, regulatory, and policy frameworks to improve the humanitarian operating environment for humanitarian actors in contexts where UN sanctions apply. And the IASC community will continue to remain seized on this important issue through the work of its dedicated task force on preserving humanitarian space, which is co-chaired by OCHA and the Norwegian Refugee Council. We are very fortunate to have with us one of the co-chairs of that task force, Mr. Aurélien Boufflers, who serves as the chief of the Policy Advice and Planning section within OCHA's Operational and Advocacy Division in New York. From the Norwegian Refugee Council, we have, of course, Ms. Berenice van den Driesch, Senior Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy Advisor based in Brussels. And of course, representing the International Committee of the Red Cross, we will hear from Mr. Brady Mabb, Head of the Legal Department with the ICRC delegation in New York. And finally, we have Ms. Catherine Strifolino, who is the Senior Manager for Humanitarian Practice for Interaction based in Washington, D.C., joining us today. Interaction, as I think you all know, is of course one of the 3 NGO consortium members of the IASC. We will hear first brief introductory remarks from each of the speakers, and after which they will answer one question from me to get us started before opening the floor for discussion, where you'll have an opportunity to share your comments and of course for questions. We will now move to our first speaker, Mr. Brady Mabb. Brady is of course the acting head of the legal department and legal advisor at the Permanent Observer Mission of the International Committee of the Red Cross to the United Nations in New York. He received his Juris Doctor from the University of California, the Los Angeles School of Law, where he specialized in international comparative law and critical race studies. Brady, why don't you set the scene for us? How significant is this resolution 2664 and what makes it so significant? Over to you, Brady.
Sure. Thank you very much, Yassine, and welcome to all. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thanks very much for being here and for having me. I want to start with what the problems were, why we needed this resolution in the first place. Humanitarian actors like the ICRC, like several others on this call, work in situations of armed conflict and instability every day, including situations where United Nations sanctions are in effect. Humanitarian actors need to be able to operate in an impartial manner to reach people in need wherever they are, whether they live in areas controlled by armed groups, whether people in positions of power happen to be on United Nations sanctions lists. The reality in the field is that UN sanctions in the past have had an impact on our humanitarian activities, whether that's assistance activities, protection activities, you name it. There have been problems with importing and distributing goods, working with suppliers and logistical hubs like and transporters for the like, as well as receiving funds from donors who tell us, we'd like to give funds to be able to fund your humanitarian activities, but we're concerned that if we do so, we will be, at risk of breaching UN sanctions. So that was the impetus for a resolution like this, for a humanitarian carve-out in United Nations sanctions. What has come before 2664 are a few things. First, in the Somalia regime, there was a humanitarian carve-out. And then in 2021, in the Afghanistan sanctions regime, there was a similar carve-out that was created. And then just before the passage of 2664, there was a humanitarian carve-out in the newly created Haiti sanctions resolution. But the real, shift in the dynamic was with 2664, precisely because of some of the elements that you mentioned, Yassine, that 2664 is a standing exemption, a standing carve-out It's permanent across all of the UN sanctions regimes, except notably for the 1267 regime, which is Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, which, unless renewed, will end at the end of 2024. So we look forward to the hopeful renewal of that. We think that it's a big benefit that 2664 is a unified humanitarian carve-out regime across all of the sanctions. That makes things much easier for us internally. It makes things easier when we're explaining to external actors like banks, like suppliers, how this works and how it applies to us. One element is that the resolution is forward-looking. So unless the Security Council decides otherwise, this resolution will apply to new sanctions regimes in the future, which is very important to us as well. I want, if I may, to spend a couple of minutes breaking down exactly what the resolution says, what the humanitarian carve-out is, because it's easy to say an exemption, a carve-out, but what actually do we mean by that? So the resolution in the first operative paragraph decides that two types of activities. First, the provision, processing, or payment of funds, other financial assets, or economic resources. So that's one. The other is the provision of goods and services. So that these two types of activities, when they're necessary to ensure the timely delivery of humanitarian assistance or to support other activities that support basic human needs, that these two things are permitted and are not a violation of the asset freeze portion of UN sanctions regimes imposed by the Security Council. That these are permitted when being carried out by certain actors. Who are those actors? The United Nations itself, international organizations, humanitarian organizations having observer status with the UN General Assembly, and the members of those humanitarian organizations, which includes, for example, the International Committee of the Red Cross as a permanent observer, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and then as well, bilaterally or multilaterally funded non-governmental organizations participating in UN humanitarian response plans, refugee response plans, other UN appeals, or OCHA-coordinated humanitarian clusters. So these are the types of entities that are covered by this humanitarian exemption. As well, the employees, grantees, subsidiaries, and implementing partners of these entities are covered by the resolution as well. So I don't want to take too much time, so I think I'll end it there. But I wanted to give everyone, really bring everyone up to speed on exactly what the resolution is and why it's so important to us. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Brady, for that very succinct presentation, but also giving us a sense of the direction of travel, where we go from a case-by-case basis to a much more sort of comprehensive approach from the Council. I'd like now to introduce our next speaker, Berenice van den Driesch. Berenice is obviously a senior humanitarian policy advisor for the Norwegian Refugee Council. She's based in Brussels, where she leads NRC's engagement and policy work with the EU and member states on matters including on the preservation of principled humanitarian action from the impact of restrictive measures. Prior to working in policy hubs, she worked for a decade in field missions with NGOs in the UN, mostly in the Middle East and in the Sahel. Berenice, a lot will rely obviously on the effective implementation by states and private sector. I think it would be interesting to hear what your expectations are in that regard, and what perhaps do you think are the steps that states should take to realize the full potential of this important resolution? Over to you, Berenice.
Thank you, Yassine, and thank you to the IASC Secretariat and to colleagues on the panel and colleagues in the audience for joining today So as NRC, just as our colleague from ICRC said, I also want to recall that we have the same vision, and we really see the UN Security Council Resolution 2664 as a genuine breakthrough and a major policy shift, one that was not even conceivable just over a year ago. So we really commend also all UNSC members for sending such a strong signal for the preservation of principled humanitarian assistance and really the facilitation of it. So with, of course, a specific thanks to the US and Ireland who've been leading this engagement. So now looking at your question specifically, I think the resolution has completely the potential to make humanitarian action safer for our team and much more effective and efficient for the people we serve. A lot of it because it simplifies the greatly complex legal environment in which we operate. That said, the resolution is also as useful as the implementation that we will see from member states. And so I want to take you through some of the steps that we see needs to be done very soon in order to maximize the full potential of the resolution. First, and it's quite of an obvious one, for the resolution to be effective, it must be adopted into national law by all UN members, and it should be respected by all stakeholders, including, of course, the donors, the financial sector, and the private sector. So that means that all 193 states of the UN must transpose the resolution into their domestic legislation as such, without additional requirements or without additional restrictions. We already seen this happening in some places with the US immediately after the passing of the resolution, but also in the UK, in the EU, in Switzerland, and we can see this ongoing, and we welcome that. A second step, and I think it's even a more important one that I want to talk you through, and it's a great call on behalf of, I think, the entire humanitarian community, is that we need to see states, both donor states, but also states that host humanitarian action, to really follow the great impulse by Resolution 2664 and replicate the same carve-out in their own restrictive measures. And here it's getting a little bit technical, so I want to explain myself. First, if we look at sanctions, UN sanctions are only a fraction of the sanctions that are adopted globally. We know that a lot of states can otherwise take what we call unilateral or autonomous sanctions, for example, against Russia or against Syria or Iran. The UN resolution does not apply automatically to those. And so in effect, humanitarian action is not directly preserved there. We are also seeing some welcome development there. For example, in the US, for example, has immediately exceeded the requirement of the resolution by introducing or updating its general license, which is the mechanism they use for allowing humanitarian activities that would otherwise prohibited. If we look at EU autonomous sanction, it's a little bit more of a mixed progress. The EU has transposed the UN exemption into what they call mixed regime. But in effect, what it means is that it still leaves a lot of EU autonomous sanctions, about 30 of them, without specific humanitarian carve-out. And so humanitarian action is not automatically protected the same way it is for UN designation. Without being too technical, it's really, this specific discrepancy is also very visible if we look at domestic counterterrorism laws and policies. So both donor countries and host states continue to apply laws and policy that can either restrict our engagement with non-state armed groups, not the ones that are designated under the UN, and that can impact our capacity to operate in some places. This is problematic because it creates a liability for NGOs working under those frameworks. And so we can still face criminal prosecution or heavy fines under those legislation. Again, here, I want to point at positive development as an encouraging step forward with the passing of a criminal law, for example, an amendment to the criminal law in Canada recently, which includes a protective humanitarian exemption. And we really call on states, both donor states, but again, host countries where we operate, to replicate the same. So I know I've sort of painted a picture a little bit in two-tone there, but really the message is that without mirroring and aligning the humanitarian carve-out in the UN exemption into all CT laws, donor clauses, autonomous sanctions, we risk defeating the very purpose of the UN exemption at first place, which is to protect, facilitate, and ensure legal clarity and predictability. I think that's also, and that would be my last point, a little bit relevant to private sector risk de-risking practices. So if we don't see a sort of simplification of the legal environment and really having predictable standing humanitarian exemption across all restrictive measures, then we really only expect complex legal environment to remain. And really for what is likely to happen is that will create uncertainties, and that risk pushing banks, exporters, and the wider private sector to over-comply and still be reluctant to engage with NGOs. So I think, yes, so still very much welcoming the UN resolution, but also recognizing there's some heavy lifting that remains to be done in terms of really replicating the spirit of it. Over, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Berenice. It's obviously quite important to have your perspective and the work you're doing represented in our discussion today. Next, I would like to invite Aurélien Boufflers to take the floor. Aurélien has been with OCHA for many years, serving in various positions at headquarters in the field. He's currently, as I said before, the chief of the Policy Advice and Planning section, which drives OCHA's policy agenda on sanctions, among other issues. Aurélien has also played a leading role in advocacy efforts that led to the adoption of the resolution. I'd be interested to hear from you, Aurélien, OCHA's perspective, including what the next steps could be to ensure the renewal of the resolution under the 1267 sanctions regime and perhaps its full implementation. Aurélien, you have the floor. Over to you.
Yassine, thank you. Good afternoon and good evening to some colleagues. I see Silke connecting from Bangkok. So thank you very much for connecting so late for you. Maybe at the outset, I mean, Yassine, in your introduction, you use the term landmark achievement, and I think we need to really insist on that. 2664 is a landmark achievement first for the Council itself. I mean, there's not many areas of consensus in the Security Council today, and yet members of the Council reach a consensus on a major policy shift in order to accommodate humanitarian action. I think that really needs to be underlined. It's of course a landmark achievement for humanitarian organization because this will facilitate their operation, for OCHA itself, because we've invested a lot in our policy work, in our advocacy over the past years. And of course, it's a landmark achievement for people in need on the ground. I mean, the resolution has a direct impact on access of people in need to assistance in several contexts. And I'll start for that because really from there, from an OCHA perspective, now recognizing that this is a landmark achievement, the objective is really to realize the full potential of this resolution and make sure that it holds over time and that it leads to even more progress on these issues of sanctions and counterterrorism. So how we do that, what are we planning? There's three areas here we need to focus on, in our opinion. The first one is, of course, briefings of the ERC to sanctions committees, which have been requested by the Council in the resolution itself. And keeping in mind that, in particular, for the renewal of the exemption for the 1267 sanctions regime, the Al-Qaeda ISIS sanctions regime, this is absolutely fundamental. 2664 is based on the trust between member states, council members, and humanitarians, and we need through our briefings to make sure that we uphold this trust, that we confirm this trust. What does it mean concretely? It means that we need to give the ERC the information, the data to give very solid, credible, comprehensive briefings to sanctions committees, including on very sensitive issues which the Council asked us to brief on. So transfer of funds to listed entities, aid diversion, risk mitigation measures put in place. But these briefings need also be the opportunity for us to outline the positive impact of 2664 and how it facilitates operation. And this is really what we're going to work on with IASC partners and OCHA offices on the ground in the coming months, and we've already started that. Of course, this can be very sensitive for some organizations. This is very sensitive information, particularly for NGOs, and we completely hear their concerns, and we completely agree with some of the risks they outline, and that's why OCHA has tried to put a process in order to collect information that is highly flexible, that gives NGOs basically a lot of latitude to decide which data or information to share with OCHA, in which format, and through which channel, and a process that also preserves the anonymity and confidentiality of the information. And that's really what we're trying to achieve. But bottom line, in October, November, we will need to have very solid briefings. Then the two other priorities, and here I'm going to echo what Berenice said. We need in the coming months to work with member states really to translate 2664 in their domestic legislation, to really adopt legislation that translate 2664 at the domestic level, and also encourage member states to take extra step to socialize 2664 with the private sector, with humanitarians in their country, with also the state donor agencies. So policies of these particular sectors also changes and taking control 2664. And the last point here too, I'm going to echo Berenice, is we need to continue the dialogue with member states. 2664 is only one step. In any context where we work, there's a web of measures of UN sanctions, unilateral sanctions, counterterrorism measures. And of course, 2664 address one part of the issue, but counterterrorism legislation, unilateral sanctions still have an impact on humanitarian operation. And we need to continue the dialogue with member states to also adopt exemption for these kind of measures. And to circle back, I strongly believe that in order to have a constructive dialogue on counterterrorism and unilateral sanctions with member states, we will need to show during our reporting on 2664 at the Sanctions Committee that we are serious and credible interlocutors. And just to end, just to say that, of course, as we progress, this is not an OCHA alone process. We coordinate heavily, strongly with our partners in the IASC and continue to do that. And beyond that, with member states and with the peace and security actors in the UN system. I mean, this is a partnership between different parts of the system, between the humanitarians and member states as well. Over to you. Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Aurélien, particularly for ending on that important sort of interagency note there, and including, of course, your very insightful interventions. Finally, I'd like to welcome Catherine Strufanillo for her opening remarks. Of course, Catherine is a senior manager for humanitarian practice at Interaction, where she leads humanitarian access policy and practice initiatives related to safeguarding principled humanitarian space. She co-chairs the IASC Bureaucratic and Administrative Impediments Working Group. She's an active member of the IASC task force focusing on counterterrorism and bureaucratic and administrative impediments, and is obviously a member of the IASC Early Warning, Early Action Analyst Group. Previously, Catherine worked for Amnesty International, Physicians for Human Rights, Save the Children, and the International Rescue Committee in various capacities. Catherine, in your remarks, it would be interesting to hear how this resolution is expected to facilitate the work of NGOs in the field concretely, and what context do you expect the resolution to make the biggest difference, and whether NGOs already see some positive developments, for example, in their relations with banks or suppliers, or in terms of risk tolerance to donors. Over to you, Catherine.
Great, thanks so much, Yassine, and it's great to be here today. Thanks a lot to the IASC for organizing this. So, I mean, first, I'm just going to echo what all of the other panelists have said. This is indeed a landmark resolution. This has completely shifted the narrative in terms of sanctions, safeguards, and we feel like we've been heard as the NGO community, right? I mean, for years and years and years, and just look at the past 6 years, right? Increase in number of country crises, and then you look at growing humanitarian need worldwide, and an uptick in sanctions and designations. So as frontline humanitarian actors, as NGOs are, it's becoming increasingly difficult to just navigate the complexity of all of these different restrictive measures to be able to feel confident to operate. So this is a huge step forward, and thanks so much to the members of the Security Council, the US and Ireland for really leading the charge and really hearing the community. So thanks a lot for that. I'm also really happy to be here because the key to one of the keys to success as it relates to the implementation of 2664 is education and outreach. One of the things that we've learned thus far is that 2664 remains known in a lot of privileged circles, but has not yet fully been socialized with financial institutions, with the commercial sector, with smaller INGOs, local and national NGOs. So we still have a lot of work to do on that because not everyone is a technical expert on these issues, and not everyone is expected to be. So we have a lot of work to do, and I'm really glad to be here because this is a component of that. So, I mean, 2664 is, as Berenice was saying earlier and Aurelian echoed, it's expected to facilitate the work of NGOs, notably when UN member states sufficiently implement 2664 within their domestic jurisdictions. That's going to be really where we start to see some progress and feel that from an operational standpoint. Colleagues have already applauded a number of UN member states, the US government, Canada. We heard, about progress in the EU, the UK has made progress. This is all really well and good. However, one of the key components that some member states, Canada, are including in their domestication of 2664 and some are not, is related to material support. That's criminal laws related to the provision of assistance to designated terrorist entities. Now, because these laws have not been sufficiently addressed in some of the jurisdictions that, have started to implement 2664, it's going to be really, really tricky for the humanitarian community, particularly the NGO community, to be providing robust information to feed into the 2664 reporting process. And so that's going to be a really key area for member states to address. To ensure that NGOs particularly do not face criminal prosecution in various jurisdictions. So that would be a big element to be aware of and to pay attention to. And then relatedly as well is the de-risking problem set. So as colleagues have mentioned, one of the big problems in this phenomena, so we have legal safeguards, we're getting legal safeguards, but that doesn't mean that financial institutions and the commercial sector feel comfortable doing business with humanitarian actors, right? They're for-profit entities, they don't need to do anything that they don't want to do, right? And so this is going to be a key area for the collective to really be addressing to ensure that the NGO community and humanitarian actors can fully enjoy the protections that 2664 provides. So very practically speaking, Yassine, to your question earlier, it's a little bit too early to tell from the NGO side the effect that 2664 has been having. I will say it's caused it's triggered a number of really constructive conversations, dialogue with various UN member states. It is supporting a greater understanding of the problems and the solutions that we're facing right now. But it's still too early to tell. And so I do want to flag that and request that everyone manages expectations around this reporting process, the data that is going to be able to be provided, because these things take a lot of time to roll out. So unfortunately, it's not, the resolution has passed and all of the problems are solved. So it's still quite early. and I mean, one of the things that we're noticing as well, and I mentioned this earlier, is it's still like 2664. We have 186 colleagues on the line today. There have been so many conversations with the IASC, but they still are in quite privileged circles, right? And so we really need to be looking to outreach and educate not just the big organizations, the bigger INGOs, but also the smaller INGOs, the local and national civil society actors that just don't have the privileges that bigger organizations do in terms of headquarters, legal, compliance, risk teams, and such. So that also is going to be really critical to support everyone and their understanding. So look, if UN member states are able to fully implement 2664 within their domestic jurisdictions, if material support provisions are sufficiently addressed, if de-risking that problem set is effectively addressed, we can point to 2664 as the mechanism that unlocked, the ability of humanitarian actors to stay and deliver when new restrictions, designations, sanctions come down. And that's the most critical part, right? We want to be able to stay and provide services to people wherever they're at, regardless of who controls the area. That's what we do. We follow principled approach. And so, we're making progress. We still have a long way to go, but this is a huge moment. And the NGO community is really looking forward to constructively engaging on the reporting process in a way that is safe right now, while also ensuring that there is sufficient information that will allow us all to continue to enjoy 2664 as is, which includes the 1267 protections. So I'll pause there. I guess, well, sorry, the only other last point is this is the first time we were discussing this on our prep call. This is the first time there's been a multi-country reporting process. If we are missing something, please just give a shout and correct us. But that's my understanding. And so we have Somalia, we have Afghanistan, Haiti was referenced, but these are country-specific safeguards, right? It's the first time there's a multi-country reporting process. So there's a lot to learn here. There are a lot of lessons to be applied. We're learning as we kind of go along. And so again, this is around managing expectations and such when it comes to the fall reporting and kind of the how quickly 2664 will manifest in domestic jurisdictions. So over from me, back to you, Yassine.
Thank you very much to you, Catherine, and of course to our other panelists today. Extremely grateful for your interventions. I'd like to now open the floor for questions and comments from our colleagues who have joined us from many parts of the world. Colleagues, if you would use the feature to raise your hand, or if you would type your question in the chat or the Q&A section, we'd be grateful. I will try to see the hand raised gesture as soon as someone does that, or we'll be on the lookout for your questions posted in the chat. While we wait for that, perhaps maybe I will begin with a question, and maybe Brady, turning back over to you. I think we all know, I think, that tens of millions of people in the world live in areas under the control of armed groups, including those designated by states as terrorist groups. And of course, ICRC works with many of these populations facing devastating consequences of conflict and violence. And given that your organization works immensely on humanitarian diplomacy, how does the ICRC intend to advocate with member states for the full implementation of this resolution? Over to you, Brady.
Yeah, thanks, Yassine. So we have been doing this since the passage of 2664. It's similar arguments to the passage of the resolution itself. The humanitarian need, I think, is clear, and as others on this call have said, as landmark as 2664 is, it's only as strong as as its implementation. And so we really have benefited a lot from strong, fast state implementation from member states like the United States, from implementation from the EU, Switzerland as well, and so we're continuing to work with member states, including on technical matters. Any states that want guidance or assistance on how to effectively implement this, we're always available. Give us a call, and we'll be happy to work with you to figure out how to effectively implement this into your own domestic sanctions regimes, to make it as effective as possible.
Thank you, Brady. Of course, one of the critical issues that you all work on, of course, being counterterrorism penal legislation, which is obviously an important aspect of all of this. I think we have a hand that's been raised. Over to Frode Moring. You have the floor.
Thanks a lot for interesting presentations. I am the resident coordinator for DPRK, which has multiple of sanctions, both UN and bilateral sanctions, and for years, decades to some extent. So based on what I'm hearing now, particularly what you said, Berenice, on the adoption in the US of various legislations, because that's the challenge, main challenge we have is in the banking system. We have well-established systems for exemptions for the UN sanctions even prior to 2664, because some of the challenges that other countries are having in non-state actors is not the same as in DPRK. But when it comes to the complete disconnect of the banking system, that still is relying on US sanctions. So can you perhaps elaborate if you have any further information on how they may, if there are any news there, on how they may adapt to legislation to allow for humanitarian finance and make exemptions on their own bilateral sanctions? I think it's not only DPR. Thanks.
Berenice, did you want to take that first, or
yes,
others? And of course, many thanks to the RCAI of the DPRK. Thank you so much for making the time to obviously join us. Berenice, over to you.
Yes, thank you for the question. So indeed, I'm less familiar with the setup for the DPRK, but it's also very interesting. So thank you for that. No, you are right. There is a link between the sort of overlapping framework and the remaining sort of chilling effect or overcompliance on the part of the private sector. Because if we take, like one example that would come to mind, for example, is on Syria, typically a place where there's like overlapping sanction city framework. So if we look, the 2664 exemption would apply in areas of Syria where designated UN terrorist groups are effectively present, and that would protect our operations there. But then at the same time, for NGOs somewhere else, we would have autonomous sanctions that are enacted by several members of the international community against individual or entities affiliated with the government. We would have autonomous or domestic city designation, for example, under the EU city, the EU counterterrorism designation. You would have also domestic ones. Some of them don't necessarily have a humanitarian exemption. You would have import restriction. You would have additional donor clause, and all of this together would clearly pose a problem when it comes to would create something that is just not readable for banks. And so I'm using the Syria example because typically, for example, following the earthquake, which was obviously a devastating moment, but brought with it some sort of immediate policy, positive policy change in the form of temporary humanitarian exemptions. And we saw them, but typically what banks were telling us there, because the exemptions were only 6 months long, the banks were saying it's great, it facilitates their exemptions throughout almost all sanctions framework in place. not counterterrorism, however, but sanctions exemptions did exist. But they were saying first, it's not across the board, so it doesn't include counterterrorism measure, and also because it was only 6 months, it wasn't long enough. It wasn't predictable enough to do so. And so I think for really, if we want to sort of revert the effects of decades of de-risking, we really need something that can actually be read by everyone involved, the states, the humanitarian actors, and the banks and the private sector. Because if things can't be read, if there's no legal clarity, then the instinct would be to just, hold back and don't take any risk.
Berenice, since you've just had the floor, and perhaps maybe if I can ask our other panelists to chime in, maybe perhaps to take on a question in the chat that is perhaps linked to this, which is from the resident coordinator's office in Venezuela. They state that the country is obviously under sanctions from some member states, especially the US, and the US sanctions include carve-outs for humanitarian funds, but overcompliance remains. You've mentioned a new general license from the US, and they'd like to know more about how both the UN resolution and the US licenses could help in cases of non-UN sanctions. So perhaps maybe over to you or to Catherine and others who, obviously Catherine, you're in DC and may be much more aware of this. So certainly perhaps over to you, Catherine, first, and then to some of our other panelists to contribute.
Sure, happy to kick this off, and thanks, unknown colleague from the RCO in Venezuela for the question. Okay, so I'm just looking at it. Indeed, the U.S. sanctions. So what we're talking about here in the U.S. context is there were a series of general licenses issued by the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset. OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control, which were very extensive. And so they offered protections for not just humanitarian assistance, and these are protections throughout US autonomous sanctions programs, which there are, a number, and you guys are living this in Venezuela. So they very expansive, so not just protection for humanitarian action, but protections for democracy, building protections for human rights, peace building. So this was massive, right? This was well beyond what 2664 was requesting UN member states to do. So there's that. However, the material support issue remains to be addressed, and you are indeed very correct when you say that over-compliance remains a massive problem. So that's when we get into kind of the de-risking and kind of strategies around de-risking, inclusive of financial institutions, as well as the commercial and other, kind of private sector entities that we need to engage with to do normal business. And so the de-risking and what Berenice was saying earlier, and the engagement with the financial institutions and these commercial actors, this is really where we need to be dedicating a lot of effort. So we've seen some success. These are very kind of ad hoc. When there is when there's an instance of de-risking, for example, and that is documented, there have been successful engagements with the U.S. government and that financial institution with the affected NGO. Around education, assurances, going through legal protections and what exists, and that has effectively unlocked some of the de-risking incidents. But that's not a panacea, and we need a systematic approach. The good news, kind of good news, is that there are a number of domestic multi-stakeholder dialogues happening. There's one in the United States. I see our CSIS colleagues are on the line. It's convened by them. So, and there's one there's a very mature one in the UK. There's some others in other European contexts, and this is all around bringing together civil society, the UN, government, and financial institutions in the private sector to look at financial access and de-risking and come up with sustainable solutions, not just ad hoc solutions. So I hope that's helpful to you all in Venezuela, and if you have follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Over.
Thanks so much, Catherine, for that. We have two questions in the chat, and we'll certainly come back to them. But I wanted to make sure we recognize our colleagues who've raise their hands. Ashley, perhaps over to you, followed by Sue Eckert, and then we'll move on to the questions in the chat. And if you do take the mic, if you would also introduce your organization, please. Over to you, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashley Subramanian Montgomery with the Charity and Security Network. Thanks to everyone for this great event and to all the panelists for these really great interventions. I was wondering if folks could share some thoughts, guidance, advice on the 1267 regime in particular, because we've also been hearing across a number of different fora the concern about that not being renewed and the kind of severe implications it could have if it's not. So I was just, wondering if folks could enlighten us on what we as particularly the NGO and civil society community can do on our end in the time we have between now and December 2024 to make sure that 1267 is extended. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley, for that. Perhaps, Sue, let's take your question as well, and then we will turn it over to our panelists. Over to you.
Thank you, Zine. Thanks for organizing this and for so many colleagues being on the meeting today. I know a number of you from previous lives, but I'm currently a member of the 1267 monitoring team. And so I wanted to speak from that perspective because I think that it's very important to understand the role that reporting will play. And in this regard, I really want to make an impassioned pitch for all of you to provide reporting, because without that, the evidentiary base is not there to make the argument for extension of the 1267 humanitarian exemption. And I'll just tell you that that there are member states who have very serious, significant concerns about the utility. One, has it worked? Has it helped in delivery of assistance? But two, on the question of diversion. And on this particular point, I just want to clarify here, because there are a lot of terminology, and diversion is this big term, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different entities. And in this regard, I want to make it very clear that whenever you report, it's very important to report specifics, because diversion is used as this umbrella. But in fact, sometimes, as we've seen in the case of Afghanistan and the Taliban, it's the Taliban efforts to try to direct humanitarian aid. That's not diversion of NGO, assistance. I mean, this has to do with interference in the delivery of humanitarian assistance. That's not diversion. So I think what we need to do is just be clear in the reporting. I will tell you that even though the 1267 monitoring team had no specific tasks assigned to it, there is an expectation, and we are asking questions wherever we go to member states to ask, are you aware of any instances in which terrorist groups have benefited from assistance? And I will tell you that largely there is a perception out there that, okay, yes, terrorist benefit, but very little in specifics. So the more specifics that can be provided, I think the better the case is made. And so I would just, again, make the request to all of you that you do report. We understand, OCHA understands how sensitive some of this information is. So report what you can, and OCHA can use that information to provide both the briefing of the ERC, but the information necessary. The other point I would just say is that within the Secretariat, they are preparing a report as provided for in 2664 on the unintended consequences of sanctions measures. And it is something that, again, it's a one-time report, but what I would say is there needs to be more information. So to the extent that you can share, I think that information is very important. And I just wanted to thank you all for allowing me to make a pitch to please report to Aurelian and his colleagues. Thank you.
Of course, thank you. Thank you so much, Sue, for joining us and for raising that very important point of reporting. Certainly, it is the basis of certainly the ERC's intervention with the Council. Aurélien, maybe we'll go to you on that question that was raised earlier, and then to any of our other panelists who wish to contribute, and then we'll move to the questions from the chat. Aurélien, over to you.
No, thank you very much, Yassine. In response to Ashley's question on 1267, I guess that's the one you mentioned. I think it's important to backtrack a bit and understand why in 2664 the exemption for the 1267 sanctions regime is only 2 years, and why it's unlimited for other regime. Without breaking confidentiality of negotiation, I mean, it is because some members of the Council had really serious concerns about the capacity of humanitarian organization to keep things under control and minimize incidental benefits to organizations concerned by the 1267 regime. I mean, that was a discussion in the Council. As a member of the Council told me, like, they were afraid of opening the floodgate. That's really the term. So the compromise reaching and of course on our side we insisted that without 1267 this exemption would lose of its relevance, because 1267 is really a regime that applies to something like 15 or 16 humanitarian operations, including Syria, including Yemen, including Somalia, including Sudan, Mali. I mean, some big ones. So we really insisted with the COPEN, the pen holders to really have 1267, and the compromise reached in the Council was this 2 years review. How do we ensure that it is renewed? I mean, first, I don't think we can ensure. I mean, it will be a decision of Council members, but I think we can help Council members reach a decision. And as Sue just underlined, the best way to convince them that this exemption doesn't open the floodgates is really to be very credible and transparent in the information we share with them during our briefings. Keeping in mind that sanctions committees and monitoring teams themselves will have their own information and will also contribute to the discussion. I have to say that there's already some good work ongoing in that regard, and I'm thinking in particular about the work done by the Deputy Humanitarian Regional Coordinator in Northwest Syria, for Northwest Syria, and the team, NGOs and UN there, which really is bringing all partners together and is coming with very solid information. Beyond that, I think what's positive in what's happening in Northwestern Syria, but also in Afghanistan and Somalia, is that the exemption, far from opening the floodgate, has also shifted the kind of dialogue between humanitarian organizations on the ground and donor agencies. It's no longer a don't ask, don't tell dynamic, but more a dynamic of we are together and we need to manage risks together. And that's where we want to take the discussion, including on 1267. Over to you, Yassine.
So thank you very much, Aurélien. Maybe we just take 2 final questions before we wrap up. We're obviously at the 4 p.m. Time now. And related to that last question, it certainly would be interesting to hear about the lessons learned from Somalia and Afghanistan reporting and how they could certainly be applied to this context of 264 reporting. And in addition to that question, maybe we just take the question from Jude Leonard from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in DC about a continuous feedback mechanism and safeguards for the reporting process, and how can we establish feedback mechanisms that allow local communities in sanctioned jurisdictions to provide input on the effectiveness of humanitarian actions and the quality of reporting while ensuring the safety of those communities. Obviously goes into the AAP aspect of the IASC's work, which is quite critical. Maybe we address those 2 final questions before we wrap up. Maybe we'll begin with you, Aurélien, since you last talked about that Ashley's questions on reporting, and then we'll go to any of our other panelists who wish to come in as well. Over to you.
I mean, as I said, on Somalia, Afghanistan, the big lesson is that the exemptions in these cases, far from making things worse, in fact, make things better. Like far from increasing a diversion or transfer, in fact, with the reporting in the background, really help donors and humanitarians to come together and have a mature discussion on risk mitigation and minimizing risks of a diversion of transfer. I mean, that's for me the big lesson, more than the process in reporting than I take. On involving local communities, I mean, that's of course a bigger question about accountability to population, and there are many discussions going on in the IASC on that, and I'm not going to get into detail, but just to note that first, local NGOs that work with the UN and within the UN coordinated response are also expected or asked to provide information, and certainly on the OCHA side, OCHA offices have been asked also to reach out to them. So it's not only international organization, but also local organization that can contribute to the reporting, and in order to preserve them, of course, their information will be treated with utmost precaution, and will preserve the confidentiality and anonymity of their contributions. Beyond that, I think there's a wider question, and I don't necessarily have the answer now, but that's maybe for the next reporting cycle, on how we involve people in need in the discussion, including in terms of how UN sanctions may or may not impede their access to assistance. In other words, not only based on reporting on the perception of humanitarians, but also on the perception of communities in terms of what is working, what is not working, and what is linked to sanctions. Over to you, Yassine.
Thank you so much, Aurélien. Catherine, over to you, and then perhaps to Berenice, and then we will conclude with Brady. Over.
Yeah, so thank you. Really great questions. In terms of lessons learned, there are some really concrete ones that I just wanted to run through very quickly that I think would be very helpful for everyone to examine and consider how potentially to integrate them into the 2664 process. So, I mean, looking at Afghanistan, a few lessons learned in that context. One is to bring NGOs and the broader civil society community in from the start. In terms of designing a process, you know, figuring out framing questions, figuring out, you know, like how to actually go about doing this safely. So bringing NGOs in and civil society and affected communities from the get-go, that is a huge lesson, and would be well applied here. Secondly, ongoing education. Tons of education, tons of outreach, continuous education with, you know, the entire humanitarian community and affected populations. That will help ensure confidence in the ability of organizations to provide reporting data over time, because they understand what it's going to, and they understand parameters that are safe through which they can report. This also links to technology. We have a lot of great tech tools out there. Many of them are secure to support sensitive data collection and analysis. So Kobo is one that's used in Afghanistan that works fairly well. And it's open source. It's used by a lot of actors to manage sensitive information. So that could be a really good option to take a look at. Translation into different languages. We're here speaking in English, and a lot of the documents that we have collectively put out are in English. So we really need to do, as the IASC, a better job about making materials much more accessible in simple language and in different languages, so people can really understand what this means and the significance of it, because the risk is they don't report, right? And then we don't get the information, or there are significant safety risks. It's also going to be really, I think, necessary, and this is again lessons learned, to put together information sharing protocols. So being very specific about to whom this information is going to, who has access to it, and what the final form will look like. And then then lastly, just to kind of underscore publicly that whatever the substance in the report says, or in the reporting to the Sanctions Committee says, it would be really important that funders do not base funding decisions off of that information. And so I'll end there. And I think, Jude, this gets to a little bit of your question too, in terms of how could there be a mechanism established for continuous communication and engagement with communities. Over.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Bernice, over to you, and then to Brady.
Oh, okay. Then very quickly, I want to thank everyone, but especially also Sue for your insider information on and your advice on 1267 reporting. Obviously, it's very essential that we make sure that the resolution continues to apply to 1267 designated groups. And it's very important that I think we try and all engage with the reporting with the view of turning it to our advantage, as you propose, and sort of debunking some of the misconception that Aurélien also mentioned on the floodgate. Of course, bearing all the necessary element when it comes to risk management and all of that, but I think it's also, for once, the opportunity to debunk the misconception that this would really open floodgates to terrorism financing, which is a conversation we have in so many circles. And then secondly, very quickly on Venezuela, I'm very happy to also take it up specifically on UN sanctions on Venezuela. But yes, it is. We continue to really advocate with EU member states to make sure that they include humanitarian exemption in their autonomous sanction regime. It's not so hopeful so far because the EU really wants to look at it on a case-by-case approach. And so for Venezuela, that would mean the next time the regime is renewed, we need to really beef up our outreach to EU member states to demonstrate the impact on humanitarian operations. So anyone interested in that at the EU, we can link up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bernice. Brady, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Yassine. Very briefly, so I want to echo as well what Sue and others have said, that the ICRC really sees this reporting process as a big opportunity to demonstrate several things: the success of the resolution so far, the ongoing work that continues to need to be done. We really think that we'll be able to demonstrate that, as Bernice was saying, that the carve-out has not contributed in a meaningful way to terrorist financing or anything of the like. So we plan certainly to have as robust of reporting as possible, and would encourage others to do so as well, for the continued livelihood of the resolution, but also just for its own sake, really. I'll conclude maybe just by saying that I think one of the clear things that has come out of this discussion is that there are two things that are true at once. One, that the resolution itself is a big paradigm shift, really, in the sanctions regime, in the sanctions world. And also, there's much more that remains to be done in implementation, in other areas like counterterrorism, material support statutes, and the like. I think with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Yassine. Thanks very much.
Many thanks to all of our guests today, and for the very interesting questions that were raised. There was also a question about where to obtain more information, guidance. Of course, we'd refer folks to the IASC website, specifically the page of the Task Force 3 on counterterrorism legislation and bureaucratic and administrative impediments. A lot of information is already there, and certainly much more, including on previous IASC work in this regard. So obviously, we've heard key insights today from our experts on the importance of this very much a landmark sort of moment for our community, and what is required of us to continue to engage in this important endeavor. We certainly congratulate the task force for engaging in this important effort, and obviously the broader humanitarian community for the tireless advocacy efforts over the years on this issue. I think looking ahead, there is much more to do, obviously, to ensure that we preserve the gains that we've made by this resolution. And as we've heard, while impactful, the resolution alone obviously cannot address all sanctions-related barriers to delivering humanitarian assistance. Looking ahead, all actors implicated in the humanitarian system, including member states, banks and commercial partners obviously must adapt their legal and regulatory frameworks in line with the resolution. We support close collaboration between our members, subsidiary bodies, and our outside partners to continue instrumental efforts to preserve humanitarian space. And of course, many, many thanks to everyone for your attention today, for joining us today, and obviously for raising the important questions that you've done so. This briefing was recorded and will be posted online in the coming days. We'll also circulate presentations from our colleagues. You can also follow us on our social media, the handles you see on the screen. And of course, many, many, many thanks for joining us. And again, many thanks to our presenters as well. Have a nice day to you all. All the best.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.